So here's your chance to jump on what each of these experts have said. But first, Ian, let me pose my question to you, and then working backwards to Fred. My question to you is, you laid out what you don't like in this area, what you think is not working, but tell us what you think could work given the changed economic environment. You were very skeptical about the G2 approach. You expressed skepticism about the G20 and its size. Well, what is out there? What needs to be put on the table? Is there something out there? Are you of the view that there isn't?
I'm an analyst first and foremost. I'm a political scientist. I'm not a policy guy. So I'm not going to stand up here and tell you what I want. I'm going to tell you what I think is happening. And so from that perspective, I think we're moving towards less government. We're moving towards less conflict. We're moving towards lower economic growth. And I think we're moving towards you look at non-proliferation. The non-proliferation regime is broken. We told the North Koreans, you test a nuke, we're going to be angry. We tested a nuke, we got angry. We didn't do anything, because there was nothing to do. The Iran situation is about to go in the same direction. We can live with that. We can tolerate it. We can continue to tolerate it until something very bad happens, at which point we'll respond and we'll create some governance. There'll be a different lowest common denominator of groupings of countries for different sorts of issues. I think we'll see this on trade, we'll see this on climate, we'll see this in a bunch of areas. Now, I think that Geithner, when you see people like Bob Zoellick say at the IMF that we are heading towards the 1930s unless serious steps are taken, I think that there is an effort by the United States to re-engage traditional allies that actually agree on basic values around how the global economy should be run. And clearly the United States is making efforts to engage the Europeans to pressure the Chinese on indigenous innovation, the level playing field, currency. Now, and the Japanese. But, I mean, of course, that would work a lot more effectively if the United States had a little more bandwidth and wasn't overwhelmingly dealing with its own domestic economic crisis. Or if the Europeans weren't going to be in the thick of the politics of austerity for the next several years. So, I mean, part of the problem, I think long term, if I'm right, and we're going to see continued no G2 and no even quiet G2, right? But a reality is more conflict between the two largest economic powers in the world that see each other increasingly in more and more zero-sum ways. Not only in zero-sum ways, not only antagonistically, but more and more antagonistic. That's a trajectory that I think eventually we will see more cohesion in the Eurozone with the United States. And I think you might see the development of the G3 if the Japanese can get their act together, Japan, the US, and Europe. We're far from that. We're far from that.
All right. Fred, let me ask you the question about the G2 concept. And I want to ask this because looking at it just from a very practical standpoint. You mentioned one slice of this climate change and Copenhagen. Just looking at what happened in Copenhagen, bluntly speaking, in the talks between the United States, the president was there, and across the table with the Chinese, it didn't translate out into what I think those that were assembled at the conference had hoped it would translate into. So my question to you, to be devil's advocate, what are the incentives here for a G2 scenario to actually work? Is there a problem with there are no incentives? And secondly, what do you say to those that will say, well, why is it G2? How come we're left out of the discussions? Which is one of the arguments that you hear constantly in the context of even the G20.
Well, the latter part of it is easy, people being left out. As I said, the whole idea behind the G2 is not to replace any of the other international institutions, formal or informal, but to make them work better. By having the U.S. and China on at least the same sides of the issue, to some extent, as much as you can on each topic, you enhance the chances for agreement in the broader groupings. That's presumably, if the outcomes are in the direction of more effective functioning world economy, that's in the interest of the other countries. It's true, they might have to hold their noses a little bit by other people being in the center room, but if the outcomes are successful, I think the others would accept it as long as they had their own views injected at all these other levels. You have to think of the global governance system as a series of concentric circles, with or without my G2. But there's somebody in the middle. Until a couple of decades ago, it was a G1, the United States. As I said, in trade it was the G2, US, and Europe. There's always somebody at the middle who's, at the end of the day, responsible and makes the main decision. Then you go to the next round, a G5 and G7. Then you go out, now maybe to a G20. Then you go to the broader formal international institutions. They're universal bodies. So it's a series of concentric circles. And decision-making in the real world has to be viewed in that sense, with inputs and outputs in both directions. The broader groups are always inputting to the narrower groups, and then the narrower groups are trying to sell their deals to the broader groups. And it works in two ways all the time, and skillful diplomacy can and has in the past managed that. But that's the way to think of it conceptually. The outsiders will complain about the representation, but if the outcomes are effective, I think that part is taken care of. The bigger question is the one you raised, and Ian raised it too. What's the incentive for China? Will China play in anything like this game? And the honest answer is we don't know. We do know historically that one of the greatest challenges to international relations as a whole is the rising power, the integration of the rising power into the global structural system in a constructive and not destructive way. And there are historical examples that are dramatic in both directions. Germany in the late 19th century is, of course, the prototype of the rising power that was rejected by the incumbents, the British in particular at the time, and the result was half a century of conflagration. Japan in that same period, and again the interwar period, to some extent the same. On the positive side, the United States, remember, was the rising power in the second half of the 19th century, and incidentally broke a lot of property during that period with our immigration laws, our tariffs in the late 19th century and all that. The U.S. helped break up the first era of globalization, but was then finally assimilated more effectively in the interwar period, despite unwilling to join the League of Nations, etc. In the post-war period, the big challenge was Japan. Japan was the rising power. It's still never been fully assimilated, but more or less successful, at least avoided major disruption. So there are stories on both sides of the equation. As I said before, the integration of China into the global order in a constructive way is historically difficult for those reasons I mentioned that make it a historically unique superpower. But why do I think maybe they would play? It's because as they become a global superpower, and as they realize, as they now clearly are, that what they do has such big impact on the world that it feeds back on them, that they have to take global economic outcomes into account. China drastically rigs its currency. It manipulates savagely. It has intervened in the currency markets by an average of $1 billion every day for the last 5 years to keep its currency undervalued by somewhere between 20 and 40%. The tragedy is it's unnecessary. They're the world's most competitive economy anyway, but they rig the currency so that they get another 20 to 40% price advantage, which is just like Ford being able to somehow do that against General Motors and Toyota, and thereby rigging the auto market in their direction. It's the same thing. It violates all international rules and norms. Well, up until now, China's largely gotten away with it. But now it's not going to get away with it anymore. Because, as Ian hinted, there is a growing international coalition that's not going to put up with it anymore. That's not just the US and Europe. It's a growing number of emerging markets who, in fact, are hit worse by the Chinese super competitiveness than we are. So now, the G20 at its meeting in Seoul coming up is about to adopt, for the first time, quantitative guidelines on how big a surplus and deficit you could run in the world economy. Well, that's not backed by sanctions. There's not going to be any formal reaction if countries violate it. The Chinese say they'll accept it, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on them to move in a constructive direction with their currency and with trade policy and other things. But even more forcefully comes the U.S. Congress. When the global system is unable or unwilling to implement its own rules, norms, and requirements, as it frequently is, whether in matters of war and peace or in matters of economics, then somebody steps into the void. And it's usually the incumbent superpower of the United States. Even though our relative power has declined considerably, our absolute power is still huge. Access to our market is critical. The House of Representatives passed a bill before it went home before the election that would begin to treat the Chinese currency manipulation as an export subsidy, which it is, and would authorize the U.S. government to apply countervailing duties against it, which it should, and that's gotten the Chinese attention. So they've let the exchange rate start to go up a bit. The question is whether they let it go up enough to head off completion of that action. But there's a precise correlation between the rise of U.S. pressure and the willingness of China to let its currency go up. The Chinese are great. They always say to us, we will never act under foreign pressure. To which I say to them, I've been in this business a long time. No country has ever moved without foreign pressure. And you won't either. And they're demonstrating by their actions, not by their words, that that's correct. So enforcement will come into the system. This is just one example of where China's actions, after time, and after they got away with a lot, absolutely right, will produce a systemic feedback, not just from the U.S., but from other countries, which will then impact adversely on their own interests, and they'll suddenly realize that taking a broader, more systemically oriented view is in their interest. Now, will that happen across the board? Will it happen quickly? Will it happen adequately? Undoubtedly not. But if you're asking over a 5 to 10 year horizon, why would China play in the G2? Accept systemic responsibility coincident with their systemic weight and impact. That's basically the answer. If you project out 10 or 20 years, keep in mind that China is going to be not just a little bit bigger, but a lot bigger than the United States. Its trade is going to be multiple that of the United States. Multiple. Its foreign exchange reserves are already $2.5 trillion. We have about $100 billion. China, on every metric, is going to approach G1 status over the next 10 to 20 years. Now, in a direct relative sense, that's bad news for us. On the other hand, it does mean that China, even if it tries to avoid it, is going to be forced to recognize that what it does is decisive in terms of the way the global economy works. And since China, greatly to its credit, has chosen a development strategy that is integrated in the world economy, it has to take notice of that. You may not realize China's economy is twice as open to the world as we. People talk about China's trade barriers, and they're important, and they need to be corrected. But China is one of the most open economies in the world. Its trade to GDP ratio is more than double ours, triple Japan. They consciously chose a strategy of integrating with the world economy, making their economic development heavily affected by what goes on in the world. And that being the case, they have to care about what the world economy does, and therefore, they'll take increasing responsibility for it.
We have a bunch of questions. I want to get to some of the questions now. I hope you don't mind. I know you just walked up, and the gentleman was before you, so if I could switch that, if you don't mind. But why don't we take both of your questions? So we'll be equal here. We'll be on equal footing, okay? If you don't mind introducing yourself.
What a stimulating panel it is.
Do you mind introducing yourself?
Am I on?
Yes.
Yes. Eldon Griffiths, I've been around for a while in the World Affairs Councils. And I think we are very fortunate.
We met years ago. You were on, of course, the World Affairs Council of San Diego. Am I correct? Orange County.
Orange County, yes, among other things. Yes. I think it's correct to say that the three countries that recently met while the United States were otherwise engaged, namely France, Germany, and Russia, who met in Paris, they concluded, heads of government level, that one of the greatest dangers to the world economy and to their own is the imbalance of currencies. And I'm quite sure that the G20, when they meet, as they will, twice during the next 6 months in Paris, will have Mr. Sarkozy, who will be the presiding officer, asking for some views about how we handle the problem of the currency imbalances. Now, the United States and China have been fussing quite a bit about the ratio of their currencies in recent months. And I would like the panel to tell us how they would advise President Obama to approach the two summits in Paris on the subject of the imbalance of our currencies.
Well,
Excellent question.
Well, nothing new. The G20 has been addressing the currency issue at each of its summits so far. As I already mentioned, that'll be a central topic at Seoul next weekend. The strategy there is to reach agreement on quantitative indicators limiting current account surpluses and deficits. Once you do that, it's then a direct step to calculate what currencies, exchange rates, are needed to stay within those bounds. So they're already addressing those issues. The French have traditionally had lots of theories about exchange rates. I've agreed with a lot of them. They've basically been sympathetic to fixed exchange rates, but that's not going to happen in the current world. The Europeans, of course, have chosen to go to a fixed currency among themselves, creating the euro. That's fine. It's a complement to their economic union. Some Europeans worry that the euro is now getting overvalued against the dollar, hurting their competitive position. At my institute, we do very systematic analyses of what we call fundamental equilibrium exchange rates. What are the right currency levels reflecting underlying economic fundamentals? At the present, the exchange rate between the dollar and the euro is just about right. The exchange rate between the dollar and the yen is just about right. Hasn't always been, but is now. The big imbalance is the dollar and the renminbi. The U.S. is by far the world's biggest deficit and debtor country. China is by far the biggest surplus and creditor country. That imbalance is huge and needs to be corrected. Seoul will only make modest progress, as I said before. I'm glad that President Sarkozy, the French, will continue on that wicket. It is essential. And if more comprehensive international agreements can be reached by the G20, based on a G2, you'd have to have it in that area, all to the good, because the more agreement you can get on limiting global imbalances, which perforce means avoiding big currency misalignments, the less the risk to the kind of breakdown of the world economy that you mentioned and that Ian mentioned before.
Ian wants to make a quick comment, and please come on up to the mic. We're going to take your question. Ian, go ahead.
I think I agree with Fred on what the American strategy and the European strategy should be. What should the Chinese strategy be? Because the Chinese want to limit that pressure to the greatest degree possible. The Americans are saying, our friend Paul Krugman is saying, if they don't go 25%, we should slap tariffs across them 25% as well. That's clearly going to lead to a trade war. Nobody wants to see it, because the Chinese aren't going to say, oh, you put tariffs on 25%, and now we're going to revalue. What the Chinese should do, if I were advising them, is make sure you pick off as many G20 countries as possible and use your growing leverage as effectively as you can. So, for example, the Indonesians didn't send their Minister of Finance to the G20 Finance Ministerial in Seoul a couple weeks ago. When I talked to UDO, he made it very clear, I don't want to get in the middle of this. It's a problem for me. The Chinese are dominant in my economy increasingly. The Brazilians, China's largest trade partner, right? Brazil is China. They didn't bother to send theirs either, because they don't want to be in the middle of it. And if I were China, I would continue to provide lots and lots of support and investing and bailing out the folks like the Greeks. I'd be buying up as much in terms of equities in key G20 countries so that I don't have to deal with this kind of pressure. That's the direction the Chinese are heading, particularly because with their new 5-year plan, yes, they want to rebalance their economy. They want to move towards much more a sustainable, consumer demand-driven economy, but they won't be able to implement it quickly, because that would require changing up the banks and putting money towards them for lending towards consumers, as opposed to industrial support with strong state-owned enterprises that aren't going to give up anything anytime soon. The big point in China is there are no strongmen in China. China's not Marxist anymore, but it is Leninist. It rules by consensus. And as a consequence, you're not going to shift these policies out anytime soon. Even if you had a couple of people that wanted to revalue by 20% in a year or two, they're not going to do it. And so as a consequence, we're going to see growing conflict.
Three quick responses. One, what Ian outlines is a formula for repeating the 1930s. Be clear about that. If the world's biggest economy and biggest trading country and biggest financial power, and creditor country, does what he said they're going to continue to do, it's a formula for bringing down the world system. The reason we've got currency wars, fears of trade wars, is because of what China's been doing. And if they continue to do it, others are going to be forced to emulate and retaliate, and that's going to be the result. It's not going to be just the Brazilians stay home. It's going to be the Brazilians, as they've already begun to do, put on capital controls, reduce the value of their own currency, defend themselves. Everybody gets in that game. That's the definition of competitive devaluations and trade controls, which happened in the 1930s. And if the biggest country does it, it assures that outcome.
All right, I want to give her a chance. And if you don't mind introducing yourself as well.
Dorothy Fox from Westport, Connecticut. I hate to get in the middle of that discussion. This has been very refreshing to hear somebody honest. You started out, Ian Brennan, by saying, we've heard the same thing 5 years ago, probably 8 years ago, and the same talking points, and today we have to do something. The platitudes about the changing economy, the need for jobs. The jobs are going over to China. Actually, I think we sent the jobs to China more than China getting the jobs. The trains from Beijing to Shanghai takes less time than from New York to Washington. The economy is unbelievable there. Is it possible to get jobs back here when the manufacturing has left? And this little book that we all have, guess where it's made? China.
Ian, I'm going to go to you first.
Yeah, look, I'm certainly sensitive. American multinationals have been putting jobs in emerging markets where labor is cheaper. There's no place that there's greater labor that's cheaper than China. Now, if I want to be more optimistic over the long term, state capitalism eventually doesn't work. It's inefficient. You look at Argentina, and it worked really well as long as they had cheap land, until they ran out of cheap land, and then the economy fell apart. You look at Venezuela, it worked really well as long as the state could take cheap oil out of the ground. They ruined their economy, and now they're running a deficit even with oil at 80, 85 bucks a barrel. Starts to fall apart. China does it with cheap labor. The problem is the scale of Chinese cheap labor is so much greater that they're going to be able to continue to run this inefficient economic system, even without being able to develop huge technology themselves for a long time. So the bubble's greater. Eventually the bubble still pops, and this is one of the concerns I have, is that the Chinese system is becoming more democratic. They don't have elections, but they're much more responsive to their people than they used to be. The response to the earthquake was very, very different than the response to SARS, when they couldn't be bothered to tell anyone. They got rid of, they incarcerated a lot of scientists that were cooperating with the WHO and the rest. The Chinese people are very happy with the Chinese government right now, but they demand growth. And they demand a level of growth that's even more unsustainable than the level of growth demanded by Americans who think it's their God-given right to have houses they can't afford, right? And so if we look over, again, honesty, if we look over the course of the next 20 years, the concerns the Chinese government will have with providing the ability to continue to ensure that the Chinese people have the growth that allows their system to be stable, here I'm speaking as a political scientist, will outweigh their desire to have great relationships with the United States and the West, though their desire to have relationships that are good with the U.S. and Europe are there. It's a priority, it's just not their top priority. And it's increasingly not their top priority, and that is correct from the perspective of the Chinese government in Beijing. Now, does this inexorably lead to the 1930s? No, because there are lots of places where there are serious interlinkages and interdependencies between the two countries that can stop them from actually going to war, but the conflict is going to grow. It's not going to get reduced. And so in that regard, I think we have to prepare ourselves for what's going to be a more difficult climate of global governance as opposed to a more, sort of touchy-feely soft.
Paula, in the interest of honesty, we just have to drop this canard about, China's cheap labor. Cheap labor is competitive only if that is cheaper than the productivity gaps between the two countries. What counts is productivity differential adjusted for rates of labor. The fact that you have cheap labor per se is worthless. If it weren't, Bangladesh would be the world's largest exporter. What is the world's largest exporter?
not China. Germany with the world's highest wages. So come on, there's no simple relationship between wages and competitiveness. It depends on productivity, just to correct you.
All right, well, on that very, should I say uplifting note, this has been a great panel, and I do want to congratulate the World Affairs Council for holding this topic today and bringing in these two terrific panelists. Please join me in thanking them.